Good afternoon and good morning wherever you are in the world. Welcome to today's webcast with Helen Beal. That's me. We're talking about the DevOps Brain today. So we're talking a bit about neuroscience. So let's get started. The first time I did this presentation a few months ago was back at Jack's DevOps in London. We were talking about how talking about kind of neuroscience in the context of technology is kind of unusual, it's kind of new, but if we think about DevOps and we think about what it's all about, a lot of people are very aware that there's a lot of kind of cultural and people issues. So I often use this bit of Gartner research, which is basically people were asked what their biggest challenge for the expansion of DevOps in their organization is. And as you can see, half the people pointed at the people issues, so these cultural issues being the biggest challenge for them in terms of expanding and adopting DevOps. Those of you familiar with DevOps have done any kind of training with us will know about CALMS. CALMS, I often refer to it as an elevator acronym, in that it's a bit like an elevator pitch, that if you were stuck in a lift or an elevator in American parlance, and you wanted to explain very quickly to somebody what DevOps was about, you can use the CALMS acronym. And as you can see, the C is for culture, the A is for automation, the L is for lean, M for measurement, and the S for sharing. So again, this draws attention to the fact that these people issues or these cultural issues are absolutely core to what we're trying to deal with in DevOps. We have John Willis and Damon Edwards to thank for the CALMS acronym. They came up with it following their first DevOps days that they did in Mountain View, probably coming up to 10 years ago. So that's great. So we know culture is important, but culture is really very hard to define. It's quite a nebulous thing to kind of put our hands on it and explain exactly what it is. But we think of it as values and behaviours, and that helps because if we think about behaviours, we can more pragmatically assess what we've got and more pragmatically have a plan to change those behaviours. And of course, what drives our behaviour is our brain. So we now are getting to this point where we're understanding that the neuroscience element becomes important in a DevOps evolution because we're trying to change the culture and change the behaviour. And in order to do that, we need to understand the brain. So let's think about this thing that we all have in our heads. Let's have some facts. So it's only about 2% of our body weight, but it does use 20% of our blood and oxygen. So it's very hungry and thirsty organ, as you can imagine, because it's very, very busy. Dehydration very quickly affects our cognitive skills. It's a lot of, fair amount of water, but it's a very fatty organ as well because it has a lot of chemistry going on inside it all the time. It's got, 86 billion neurons within the brain. We can talk more about neurons in a minute. Lots and lots of blood vessels, hence it's using all that blood and all that oxygen. Which is pumping through very fast. And our particular species, Homo sapiens, has the largest brain proportional to body weight. Perhaps we can draw some conclusions from that in terms of kind of our place in the world at the current time. Many scientists are calling this the Anthropocene era in terms of the way that the humans are really modelling what's going on the planet, which has some good effects in some respects and then has some potentially negative effects and things like climate change and the extinction of multiple species and things like that. So that is our human brain. A bit more about neurons then. So these neurons they basically communicate with each other using these both electrical and chemical signals, and they link via axons, and that produces a neural circuit. And then we have lots and lots of different circuits in our brains, and different circuits perform different tasks. So different parts of the brain do different things. Again, very, very busy, these things, transmitting 1,000 nerve impulses per second. There's 10,000 specific types of neurons in the brain. We're just going to talk about one in particular later on. And that information, not sure how useful this information is for you, but brain information travels at 268 miles per hour. I'm not sure how they worked that out, but it's an interesting fact nonetheless. So That's a bit about the brain. We've all got one. Let's think about now then how we are using it. So in DevOps, we talk more increasingly actually about the concept of unlearning. And we also talk very much about continuous learning, organizational learning or learning organizations. And in fact, many of you are probably familiar with the Phoenix Project as a seminal work in the DevOps space. Some of you may also know there is an audio project called Beyond the Phoenix Project that was launched last year. It's a conversation between Gene Kim and John Willis, and they talk about lots and lots of things over about 7.5 hours of material. And then at the end, I'll skip to the end, they talk about these high-performing organizations as identified through things like the State of DevOps reports, being dynamic learning organizations. So we know how important learning is in order to move our agility and DevOps capabilities forward. So this is Barry O'Reilly, who also published another book last year, and his is called Unlearning. And he defines unlearning as the process of letting go of or moving away from and reframing once useful mindsets and acquired behaviours that were once effective but are now limiting our success. So it's not about kind of forgetting or discarding the knowledge or experience that we've got, but it's consciously letting go of outdated information, actively gathering in and taking new information to inform our decision making and our action. So in our world of the kind of DevOps, technological agility space, this is things like moving from, for example, waterfall type processes or methodologies to agile methodologies. So, moving from those older methods, so moving away from kind of Prince2 type capabilities and more towards Scrum type capabilities. So building on the knowledge we already have. So we are asking people to consciously change the way that they work. So we're asking them to think more incrementally and have more autonomy in teams and do things differently. And this is very challenging for lots of people. This idea of mindset comes up a lot, and the original kind of thoughts around mindset was that some people have a growth mindset and some people have a fixed mindset. And growth mindset people embrace failure as an opportunity to grow and learn, and they have the belief that they can do anything they want and that challenge is good, and that they are the masters of their destiny and in control of what they can achieve. And fixed mindset people are more assumed to think that they can't learn, and they are very, they've been born with what they've got and that's it. But what neuroscience has recently told us is actually there is something called neuroplasticity, which means that all of our brains can change and can be grown. We just have to make the choice to change that. So this is really important, as if you're a change leader, having conversations with people about making improvements and about changing the way they work. People that you may think that they can't learn, if you tell them about neuroplasticity, it can really help to kind of release that sense and encourage these people to think about new ways of doing things. And research has actually shown that simply knowing about this brain plasticity can improve learners' ability to learn. So it's very important to kind of set that expectation with people. And it gets very interesting when we think about what we really mean with plasticity and how different brains can be trained in different ways and how brains can kind of evolve over time. So a few examples I've got for you. One is that our taxi drivers here in London have a larger hippocampus than the bus drivers. And the hippocampus, you can see where it is in the brain, so it's like right deep in the centre part. It's also known as the entorhinal cortex. And that is kind of like our GPS system, our mapping system, if you like. So because the taxi drivers, in London we call it the knowledge, and they all get, our taxi drivers are very highly trained. They basically hold like a London A to Z in their heads, so you can ask them to take you anywhere and they will know where it is. This was obviously extremely important in the past, before we had things like Google Maps. So they are holding a huge map themselves in their head, whereas a bus driver just does a few routes, so they are not holding the same map. So that is why the taxi drivers have a larger hippocampus. Multilingual, bilingual, multilingual people also have a slightly bigger part of their brain. It's the part called the left inferior parietal lobule, and that learning the second language actually kind of functionally changes the brain. So that is bigger with people that speak more than one language than people that only speak a single language. So, you know, you're kind of exercising that brain muscle and making it bigger and stronger. Similarly, if you are exercising brain muscle and indeed other muscles by doing things like playing an instrument, so being a professional musician, you are also kind of increasing that cortex volume or that grey matter volume in these three new areas that you can see are popped up on this slide. So the premotor and the motor cortex, and also the superior parietal lobule, are bigger because you're practicing it, you're using that brain. This kind of concept of practice is very important in the DevOps world, and we keep coming back to that. And then I love a squirrel. One of my kind of favourite examples of this brain plasticity is in squirrel. You can see him here happily eating his nut. Squirrels' brains actually grow every autumn or fall, if you're in America, because this is when the squirrels are burying their nuts, which will be their food supply for the winter. And they need to remember where they've buried their nuts. So as they bury them, they start building a map that will enable them to find them again and therefore survive into the spring. And then that brain map disappears again in the spring to be grown again with a new map the next autumn. So that's a little bit about how brain plasticity works and a few parts of the brain. Let's now talk about working memory. So working memory obviously is what we use when we are learning. So you can take a look at this set of letters, kind of look at them, and then you're going to try and remember them. So having just looked at them, can you remember any of those sets of letters? I've looked at them a few times. I still actually can't remember any actually spring to mind now. But if I look at this set, which is actually the same set of letters, but what they're done here is that they're grouped into ones that you're more likely to recognise. So if you take a look at them, and then what can you remember this time? Well, I can remember BBC, I can remember UFO, I can remember RAF, I can remember MRI. And this shows you basically how the working memory works. So working memory can only hold a small number of chunks of information at any moment in time. So that first set of letters that I showed you, you were trying to learn all of the letters individually. But that second one, your brain already knows the BBC, probably, the British Broadcasting Association Corporation. It already knows things like UFO, unidentified flying object. It knows RAF. We know that's Royal Air Force. So it's much easier to remember those. There are effectively fewer chunks there for you to learn. So it's important to remember how that works when we're asking people to learn. There's only so much learning that we can do at any one time, and only so much speed we can learn at. But what gets very interesting is as we learn more, as we practice these things, so this is our frontal lobe here where all that working memory was happening, as we practice, we move that activity from the working memory to regions more involved with automatic and unconscious processing, so away from the front of the brain. So practice helps consolidate these freshly learned processes, and we do them almost without thinking, and reduces the burden on working memory, thus releasing it for us to learn and discover and explore new things. So I'm sure all of you have experienced things like driving home from work and getting home and kind of thinking, can't even remember driving home. And that's because it's something you do so often, it's gone into your automatic kind of unconscious processing area. So one of the concepts we talk a lot about in the kind of lean elements of DevOps is doing things like using from the Toyota Production System or TPS canon of work, things like the improvement kata. Those of you that are martial artists will know that a kata is a pattern that you repeat over and over. So when you're learning martial art, you'll learn a move and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and practice it in the dojo until it becomes something that you do naturally, which is obviously very important if you are in combat, that you do not have to kind of stop and think, what do I do when someone's about to punch me in the face? It's kind of important that you kind of know that instantly. So the improvement kata is really about daily continual improvement at work, and it's about following this pattern all the time. So the pattern is looking at the long-term vision or goal, or in this example from Spotify, the challenge, and then looking at our current condition, then deciding what our next target state is, and then what we call PDCA, or plan, do, check, act. Some people say plan, do, study, act. A little experiment to get between those two conditions. If we keep taking that approach, we learn to practice that way. So when we have practice, we reach this level of kind of automaticity, we call it, in the brain. So you can see that happening in the brain on the screen here. So something we don't know very well, using lots and lots of a brain, lots of activity going on. And then when we practice it a few times, it as we know, moves to working memory. So you can see the brain on the right is doing a lot less activity because this person is now a master of that activity. So there's a thing called cognitive load theory, which assumes that our knowledge is stored in our long-term memory in the form of schemas. And these schema organise the elements how it's used, and you can build schemas and combine them. So as we become more skilled performers, we combine these complex schemas. So this week, I have been at the DevOps Enterprise Summit in London, which has been a really, really amazing event. One of the things that were there, if you like, or the opportunities there, is a new book by the rather marvellous Matthew Skelton and marvellous Manuel Pace. And I had an opportunity to go to their talk about the book and actually spent some time with the guys having a chat about it as well. And Matthew actually has a master's degree in neuroscience. So unsurprisingly, quite a lot of what informs the thoughts around these team topologies for organisations that are trying to adopt these new ways of working is quite informed by neuroscience. He also talks about sociotechnology, and we talked about neurotechnology as well. So this idea that actually using what neuroscientists are learning about the way that we operate as human beings and applying that to the things that we're trying to do at work, even in the technology industry, it's actually very useful. And I felt that kind of myself as well, that as technologists, we can be quite kind of cynical sometimes about practices that don't have good evidence behind them. And this is, I think, why neuroscience, I think, will become more important to the way that we're working, particularly in technology, because we love science, and we love data and evidence and things that have a solid background. So some of the things that the Matthew and Manuel are saying is, software that is too big for our heads works against organizational agility. So they have advice to limit the size of the services and products to the cognitive load that the team can handle. That each service must be fully owned by a team with sufficient cognitive capacity to build and operate it. So it's opening up this conversation for all of us as individuals and us as individuals operating within a team to understand what cognitive capability we have between us, and whether that's matching to the work that we've got. So there's a long, long conversations and things still to be had here in terms of how actually to measure cognitive load and how to measure sizes of software and how to align the two things. And it does also open up some quite interesting conversations around the relationship between mastery and cognitive load, because as we've just seen, as we become masters, as we practice certain things and become higher performers, that working memory, the burden on the working memory moves, and it moves into automaticity and the long-term memory. So you can almost, I think, measure mastery by measuring cognitive load as we learn. So let's talk about these kind of environments that we're trying to work in then as well. So we talk about blame quite a lot in the DevOps kind of cultural world. A traditional command and control type hierarchy can often be quite blame ridden, quite kind of punishment focused. And people can live in a fear of the climate of fear of doing the wrong thing or experiencing failure. And that is quite an anti-pattern towards us learning. So many organisations we work with are in some kind of transformation, which is often very disruptive and very frightening for people, and is a big bang thing, and often fails. So we kind of have this conversation about, is this revolution or is this evolution? We are big proponents of steering towards an evolutionary approach rather than transformation approach at Range 4. What we see in the organisations we work with, that if people plan more incrementally, which is of course at its very core a more agile approach than transformation, which is big bang and waterfall and planning and milestones. If we have more of a constant inspection, more of an expectation that we're making small changes rapidly and repeatedly and often, that helps us to get further faster. But lots of organisations are kind of transitioning between states. So a lot of these agile transformations are actually kind of waterfall projects, moving us away from waterfall, ironically. But while we're in transition, and by transition, I think it helps to, if we think of a company as brains or humans, so, we've got a number of people that are thinking and working in certain ways, and we are transitioning towards them working and operating in a different way. They are likely to be disrupted, and they are needing to acclimatise or acclimate to the new ways of working until that becomes the way things are done around here, and it becomes automated in the brain. So these are the kind of transitions that we're demanding around DevOps. So I've touched on this quite a few times, saying the word incremental. So we're trying to move away from large batch size to something smaller. We're trying to move away from these hierarchical structures where we've got lots of SMEs or subject matter experts in skill-centric silos to a place where we have lots of smaller, autonomous and dedicated cells. We want to try and remove lots of centralised process and decentralise it, which supports the autonomy that we're trying to drive. We want things like releases to be done so frequently in such small chunks and with tools and things that help, that they become very easy. It's just what we do all the time, rather than being something that we all have to go in at the weekend with and have our pages on if we still lived in the 1970s. Our Slack channels open, perhaps. So, the information is moving, the culture, again, this idea of blame and failure and fear. We want to start understanding that failure is a learning opportunity. We want to do it fast, we want to do it early, we want to do it smart, and we want to trust people whilst protecting them from doing things that will cause a kind of catastrophic failures. There's kind of many shades of failure, if you like. Obviously, if you're running some kind of critical national infrastructure, like all the banking services that most of the population uses, you don't want a failure that's going to bring down their ability to be paid or acquire cash or buy things. That would be awful. So we need to think about that in the context of failure. And then we want to think about metrics. We want to move towards flow and definition of done. We no longer want to think about kind of our silos and just doing my thing. We want everybody to understand that there is an end-to-end flow and that the work isn't done until the value outcome has been realised. So we're asking people to do quite a lot of change. It's quite a big ask for a lot of people. And this is Britt Andreatta, who's written a number of books, but the one that I'm particularly looking at here is one that's called Wired to Resist. And Britt's not a neuroscientist herself, but she's a writer and a researcher, and she's looked at a lot of neurological and neuroscientific research herself. And she has identified that there are actually several structures in the brain that are designed to protect us for the potentially harmful effects of change. And this is evolutionary, right? So if you think about things like bees, Bees are well known for their journeys to and from the hive, and if you put something different near the hive, they will stop and inspect it and then go back to the hive, and then they'll ignore it again because they know what it is. So they've identified there's a change, they've seen that change is the risk, and then they've identified the risk and they've decided it's not bad. So from a human perspective, perhaps in the past, if we were wandering around the Masai Mara and a bush looked different from what it looked like yesterday, we might want to be careful about that bush because maybe that bush contains a lion. So you can start seeing why there is perhaps an evolutionary reason why our brains are actually wired to resist change effectively. So again, we just need to think about this as change leaders. It's kind of, people always report that they have a high appetite for change. And I think that's because people are always open for improvement. But the reality of us accepting change and doing things differently can be more difficult. So back to this kind of conversation about evolutionary things and how to help people manage change. Again, from Damon Edwards, this is a DevOps Kaizen. So we also call it big J's and little J's. Basically what we're saying is that if we do one massive change, it is a massive shock for people, and we're going to see a big dip in productivity, and it's going to take us time to recover from that shock and disruption. Whereas if we think about having lots of frequent but much smaller changes, the productivity impact will be much reduced, and we will recover quickly, faster from it. And we will, over time, we will achieve a level of productivity way beyond that had we done the one big, huge, enormous change. So another problem with these big changes, as we've established, is these big changes are scary for people. They cause shock and they cause disruption and they cause fear. And fear is really unhelpful in change, because when we're asking people to change, as we've kind of covered, we're asking you to change, we're asking you to learn a new thing. And if we are afraid, it doesn't help us learn, because the fear causes a subcortical activity in the amygdala, which you can see here very near the hippocampus. And that subcortical activity there activates our working memory network that we just learned about, the frontal lobe, where our conscious attention happens and when we are learning. And that makes it really hard for us to learn. So we want to try and avoid scaring people because we want them to learn. And then we have this other thing as well. So we have a kind of an avoidance response if we're afraid. So it's like we actually actively, our brain kind of unconsciously and actively removes us from the situation. So we need to be conscious of that and help people feel safe and not frightened. So it's quite a lot on this slide. Really, it's talking about creating a psychologically safe environment and actually using systemic safety to support what we're trying to do. So, making sure that leadership understand the shades of failure and what is and isn't acceptable, creating guardrails, using tools to make sure that we can recover quickly, or even that we're preempting failure, using things to kind of limited blast radius approaches so that we can test new things out with smaller groups of people rather than, risking bringing the whole lot down. So there's lots of things that we can do to make our environment safe and help people be less fearful. And there's a kind of another side to this coin as well, which is really about how to encourage people. So we talk about not putting them off. Now we're going to talk about how to positively encourage them, so rewards and motivation. So you remember just now we talked about the avoidance response. There is also an approach response as well. And this is our anticipation of the novel, and this brings us closer, so we step forward. So we need to encourage this uptake of the neuromodulators that will they influence the way that our frontal cortex operates. Our brain then is allowed to become more focused. So completely the opposite response from what fear is correcting for us. So we need to think about that and how to motivate people. David Rock, he describes himself as a neuro leader. His neuroscience research showed us how the brain operates at work. Essentially, he has this thing called the scarf model, which works on the premise that that amygdala that we were just looking at, that's kind of often referred to as the lizard brain as well. It's where our fight or flight response sits. So this kind of fear and avoidance and approach and reward mechanism sits. So what David Rock's research tells us is that we all have a different motivational style at work, and if that motivational style is threatened, we experience that almost unconscious kind of lizard-like fear response, whereas we can also have the very strong reward novelty response. So there are self-assessments and things you can do on the internet, or you can kind of probably have a feel for it yourself. So I'm pretty sure that my major motivator is autonomy. I don't like to be micromanaged. That can make me feel very stressed, but I do get a huge amount of satisfaction over creating things myself and events with other people, and blogs and content and things like that, and that makes me feel good. So as leaders, we can be aware that our teams and our individual people, and in transformational leadership, we very much care about the individual and their motivations. This gives us a framework to work with. And similarly, as leaders talking to our team, this is one particular type of neuron that I did want to talk about, which is the mirror neuron. And the mirror neuron activates when we see someone doing something. So if someone smiles at you, you will automatically smile back at them. So it's very important to be aware that as a leader, if you are exhibiting kind of passion and enthusiasm for your subject, it literally is contagious. So again, we need to have this as a tool for our learning if we can mirror what we're doing. So bearing all of this kind of in mind, these are our kind of top tips for using this in your work. So first of all, as a DevOps agent of evolution, be conscious or mindful of these concepts, use them, have conversations about neuroscience, study it, read some of the books or some of the materials, or go on YouTube and look at some of the videos, and then discover what engages your colleagues through learning, by learning about their interests and their existing understanding. And, actually consciously observe how they respond to different approaches, and try and link that to what you're actually seeing in the brain. So, don't try and move away from conversations like, I'm frustrated with so-and-so because he won't come and do this, or when I ask him to do that or whatever, but actually try and understand what's going on in their brain at the time. Create this safe place to improve learning. And then, of course, be the change you want to see. You are a mirror to these other people. So these slides are available online, and do feel free to look at them. And that's it for today. That is our webcast. So thank you very much for joining, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.